Missouri, June 23, 1855. The night hung thick with heat, cicadas shrieking like restless spirits as the moon lit the rolling farmland. In a cabin, barely large enough for breath, a 19-year-old enslaved girl waited with a wooden stick clutched in her trembling hands. Her name was Celia. For years, she endured her master's assaults in silence, but tonight, the silence would break. One desperate strike would echo louder than any chain. Robert Newsom was no ordinary farmer. He was the embodiment of Missouri's slaveholding power, cloaked in respectability, yet a predator in his own house. Since Celia's 14th year, he claimed her as property of flesh, not just labor. Her body was his field to plow, her pain his nightly harvest. But the cracks of history had already begun to split the soil. Slavery's contradictions smoldered. Celia's act would not be seen as justice, but as defiance against a system built on cruelty. This is not triumph, but tragedy. A tale of fire beneath chains, of a young girl who dared to resist and face the gallows. History often celebrates conquerors, but the whispers of the silenced burn deeper. Journey with me through Celia's story. And if you believe her voice deserves remembrance, share it, subscribe to it, and let her defiance echo beyond the smoke of Missouri's past. The rural countryside of Missouri stretched endlessly, golden fields masking the blood and sorrow buried beneath. It was here in 1850 that Robert Newsom, a prosperous farmer, purchased Celia. She was just 14, a child torn from innocence and thrust into servitude. To outsiders, Newsom appeared a man of standing, the patriarch of a household sustained by enslaved labor. But within the shadows of his farm lay horrors unseen. From the very night she entered his home, Celia's childhood ended. He forced himself upon her, transforming her body into a battlefield. Neighbors may have suspected, whispers drifting from lips to ears, but in Missouri's 19th century order, such violence was not scandal. It was routine. The law offered no protection for enslaved women. Their cries carried no legal weight, their suffering erased as if it were the natural rhythm of life. Each night footsteps drew near, the creak of boards announcing terror. Her heart pounded not with anticipation but dread. Each assault hollowed her, leaving her silent yet alive, forced to carry both shame and survival like twin stones upon her chest. But even in silence, embers smoldered, rage, unspoken, gathered within her. A child forced into womanhood, Celia began to see her body not as his possession, but as the last ground left to defend. Years etched themselves upon Celia like scars, each one a testament to the relentless weight of enslavement. By the age of 19, she had already borne children whose bloodline was shackled even before their first breath, tied to the same system that denied her body, her voice, and her freedom. Every day was a labor not just of the fields, but of survival, and every night brought the cruel ritual that Newsom claimed as his right. He treated her body as property, a possession to dominate at whim, reducing her humanity to mere flesh to be commanded and violated. Yet beneath the exhaustion, beneath the constant erosion of her spirit, a flicker of defiance had begun to grow, quiet but persistent. George, another enslaved man who understood the cruelty of their shared reality, became her confidant, perhaps the only person who could glimpse the ember of rebellion that she hid from the world. He encouraged her, reminding her that dignity demanded resistance, that silence would only perpetuate the chains that bound her, not just physically, but spiritually. "You must make him stop," he said, his voice carrying a weight that became more than advice. It became prophecy. Those words lingered in her mind, echoing with the inevitability of action that could no longer be delayed. The years of fear, of relentless intrusion, began to transform into quiet, simmering fury. She imagined rebellion not as a fanciful dream, but as a necessity born of desperation. Celia pleaded with George to protect her, to somehow shield her from the nightly invasions, yet he insisted that the power, the agency, could not be taken, it could only be claimed. That seed, once planted, burrowed deep into her resolve. In the cabin, she whispered to herself in the darkness, rehearsing the moment when she would no longer be prey, when her body would belong to her alone. In the fields, she toiled beneath the sun, her muscles aching, her hands raw. Yet even in the backbreaking labor, she nurtured that quiet rebellion. Every glance, every breath, every whispered word became preparation for the night when she would reclaim herself. Celia, once silent and submissive, began to dream not of escape or forgiveness, but of justice in its most primal, necessary form, a night where she would no longer endure, a moment where the power that had been denied to her would finally belong to her, even if only for an instant. The thought was both terrifying and liberating, and it consumed her every waking hour. The evening of June 23rd descended with a heavy sky, thick clouds hanging low and pressing the world into an oppressive stillness. The air was humid, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere conspired to remind Celia of the weight of fate bearing down upon her. She moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, each step measured, her heart hammering in anticipation. Shadows flickered across the walls cast by the faint glow of the fire, and in that dim light, she prepared herself for a confrontation she had imagined countless times, but never dared to enact. A stout stick lay hidden near the hearth, crude in shape, yet in her hands it felt imbued with the force of every stolen moment, every violation endured, every humiliation imposed upon her. She understood the stakes. Discovery would mean certain death, yet enduring the next assault was a slow, relentless sentence that had already hollowed her soul. Then came the footsteps, deliberate and confident, each echo a cruel reminder of her lack of control. Robert Newsom entered as he always did, his presence demanding obedience, his gaze claiming her as though she were mere property. He reached for her with the same entitlement he had exercised for years, expecting compliance without question. But this night was different. Celia's body, once trained to yield, was now an instrument of defiance. Her hand gripped the stick with a force born of desperation and fury, and in a motion that condensed 5 years of suffering into a single act, she struck. The wood met flesh with a sharp crack that split the stillness of the cabin, reverberating as if the universe itself had recoiled. He staggered, disbelief etched across his features, and another blow followed, each strike a punctuation to years of silent suffering. When it was over, silence fell, heavier than any sound she had known. His body lay still, broken, and for the first time in half a decade, Celia breathed without the suffocating weight of chains around her chest. Her hands trembled, stained with the evidence of her defiance, yet they felt powerful, capable, alive. The man who had believed himself untouchable now lay lifeless at her feet. This was not a triumph born of malice, nor an act of pride. It was survival. Every instinct, every suppressed scream of the past 5 years had culminated in that night, that room, that moment. She had survived, and in doing so, she had made a statement. No law, no master, and no system built on oppression could ever fully erase. Panic clawed at Celia's chest, a cold, insistent pressure, yet beneath it, a fierce clarity guided her every movement. She understood, with sobering awareness, that the law would never hear her truth. In Missouri, the courts recognized her not as a human being with rights, but as property, a possession whose only value lay in labor and obedience. Every heartbeat reminded her of the precariousness of her existence, yet it was also a call to act decisively. She moved with a grim determination, lifting his lifeless body with trembling arms, carrying it toward the fireplace where embers glowed like judgmental eyes, mocking her defiance. Each step was weighted with fear, but also with a strange sense of necessity, a realization that she was reclaiming, in this terrible act, a fragment of autonomy denied for years. Once at the hearth, she began to feed wood and flesh to the flames. The crackle and roar of burning flesh became a macabre hymn, a dark liturgy in which she offered both vengeance and survival. Smoke spiraled upward, curling into the corners of the small cabin, carrying with it the acrid scent of charred skin into the cold night air. The fire consumed everything it could, yet even as it raged, fragments remained, bones, ash, and traces that would not fully vanish. The flames bore witness to her act, a silent testament to the years of abuse and indignity she had suffered. As she worked, her mind raced with a torrent of thoughts. What story could she tell if questioned? How long could she conceal his disappearance before suspicion fell upon her? Fear twisted within her, yet beneath it ran a grim calm, the clarity of someone who understands that certain actions cannot be undone, only endured. She had done something forbidden, unthinkable, in a society that denied enslaved women the simplest rights over their own bodies. She had said no. And in uttering that silent, devastating refusal, she had taken a life. The enormity of her deed was not yet fully comprehended, even by herself, but the consequences were inevitable. That night of defiance, born of desperation and necessity, would not remain private. It would erupt into public scrutiny, a trial not only of murder, but of the very possibility that an enslaved girl could exist as a human being, worthy of recognition, dignity, and the right to resist oppression. Celia had acted, and in doing so, she had challenged the very foundations of a system designed to erase her. By morning, the absence of Robert Newsom sent immediate ripples of unease across the sprawling farm. The day began like any other, but the sudden void of his presence cast a shadow over the familiar routines. His daughters wandered through the rooms and fields, calling his name, their voices trembling between concern and disbelief. Neighbors gathered, murmuring behind closed doors, their curiosity and fear intertwining. Suspicion, as it so often did in a society built on domination, quickly turned toward the enslaved people who lived and worked under Newsom's roof. The community, gripped by a mix of anxiety and outrage, began interrogating those who toiled in the cabins and fields, seeking an explanation that could restore order and reassert the fragile hierarchy of authority. Eventually, the attention focused on Celia. Fear was etched deeply across her young face, but there was no room to hide the truth. Under relentless questioning, she confessed, her voice carrying the weight of years of abuse and suffering. She admitted to striking Newsom down, to ending his life in a moment of desperate self-preservation. She admitted to setting the fire that consumed him, an act meant to erase both evidence and a reminder of her torment. Yet her confession went further than actions. It revealed the reality behind them. She spoke of survival, of the unrelenting violation she had endured, and of the years during which her body had been treated as property rather than human. Her words, raw and honest, sought not to justify cruelty, but to explain the inescapable pressures that led to her resistance. Still, her truth offered no protection. The sheriff moved with procedural coldness, binding her hands and placing her in a stark, icy cell. The iron bars, rigid and unfeeling, symbolized the justice of the time, justice that recognized property over people, fear over compassion. Word of this incident spread rapidly. The narrative shifted, shaped by the prejudices of the community and the sensationalism of local newspapers. Celia's act of self-defense was recast as rebellion against white authority, rather than a response to years of abuse. Conversations in homes and public spaces whispered her name, with a mix of horror and fascination. The case quickly transcended its immediate context. It became a test of conscience for a nation, forcing uncomfortable questions about slavery, power, and humanity. Yet in Missouri, at that moment, conscience was already poisoned, corrupted by centuries of systemic oppression, and the voice of an enslaved girl, no matter how truthful, would struggle to find justice. The trial of Celia began in October 1855, in a courtroom thick with tension and the weight of expectation. The benches were crowded with men of property, men whose very identities were tied to the preservation of the social and economic order that slavery demanded. This trial, they understood, was about more than one death. It was a test of the system itself. At its heart lay a question that threatened the foundations of their world. Could an enslaved woman have the right to resist sexual violence? Could her body be considered her own, even for a moment, in a society that claimed ownership over her very existence? These questions were not merely theoretical. They carried the potential to upend the carefully maintained hierarchy that defined every plantation, every household, every legal proceeding in Missouri. Celia's defense, led by the young attorney John Jameson, approached the case with fervor and moral urgency. He argued that every woman, regardless of status or color, had a natural right to defend her own body from assault. If the law failed to recognize that basic human truth, could it honestly be called law at all? Jameson painted a picture of Celia not as a criminal, but as a girl trapped in circumstances of unthinkable cruelty, whose desperate act of self-preservation demanded understanding, not condemnation. Yet the prosecution's counterattack was ruthless. They painted Celia as a cold-blooded murderer, carefully erasing the context of abuse and violation that had led to her strike. Her voice, her suffering, her humanity was systematically stripped away, leaving only the abstract crime of her act. Witness after witness took the stand, their testimonies twisted and framed to reinforce the prevailing narrative. Enslaved people existed to serve, not to resist, and certainly not to claim the same rights as white citizens. All the while, the unspoken truth lingered. It in the room, like smoke. The court was not judging whether Celia had committed murder, but whether she had the audacity to exist as a human being in defiance of her assigned status. Every word spoken, every objection overruled, every law invoked, carved deeper into the grim reality of Missouri's justice system. It did not exist to protect her, or anyone like her. It existed to safeguard property, to enforce submission, to maintain the illusion of absolute control. In that courtroom, the law and morality diverged sharply, and the young girl on trial stood at the center of the collision, her fate reflecting the fundamental injustice that underpinned a society built on bondage. The jury, all white men, sat in the courtroom, their faces set in masks of impartiality, but they did not hear what was truly before them. They weighed not the suffering, the fear, or the desperation that had marked Celia's life, but the value of Robert Newsom, a man whose wealth and standing were intertwined with the ownership of other human beings. In their eyes, the loss of a master was a loss to the system itself, a disruption of property rights, not a tragedy wrought upon a human being. Celia's testimony, her words of violation and abuse, was silenced or dismissed, deemed irrelevant to the question at hand. The law of Missouri, they insisted, did not recognize the right of an enslaved person to defend herself from the very person who claimed ownership over her body. In the eyes of the court, her body had never belonged to her. To strike Newsom was not an act of survival, not an assertion of dignity. It was destruction of property, a crime against the social order that kept men like Newsom in power. The trial moved with chilling swiftness, each step measured, each argument muted by the prejudices that underpinned the system. The verdict was inevitable long before the final words were read aloud. The jury declared her guilty of murder, and in that declaration, they affirmed more than the law. They affirmed the supremacy of ownership over humanity. Beneath the cold, official words of judgment lay something darker, more insidious. They had judged not merely her act, but her audacity to resist, her refusal to be entirely submissive, her insistence on claiming even a fraction of the humanity denied to her. Outside the courtroom, the enslaved women who had known her, worked alongside her, or simply heard of her courage, wept quietly in the shadows. They understood too well that her fate could easily become theirs, that the gallows awaited any who dared challenge the rigid hierarchy that defined their lives. To the outside world, her death would be recorded as punishment, a consequence of a violent act. But to those who lived under the yoke of slavery, it was a warning, a stark demonstration of the cost of defiance. And yet, even in that warning, the seed of resistance lingered. Celia's courage resonated quietly in the hearts of those who understood that the act of survival itself could be revolutionary. Awaiting execution, Celia sat alone in her small, cold cell, a 19-year-old girl confronting the noose that awaited her. The air was heavy with the chill of approaching winter, and the walls around her seemed to close in, mirroring the oppression that had defined her life. She was denied mercy at every turn. Appeals were filed on her behalf, legal arguments that no woman should be forced to endure endless violation, that no human being should be treated as mere property, were presented with urgency and conviction. Yet the courts turned away, blind to the humanity of the enslaved and deaf to the injustices inflicted upon her. Each passing day brought her closer to the gallows, the looming date a cruel reminder that the law upheld ownership and domination rather than fairness or compassion. In the cold, silent hours of her confinement, stripped of freedom yet not of spirit, Celia's presence began to expand beyond the narrow dimensions of her cell. She became myth before she became martyr, a symbol of defiance, whose story traveled quietly among the enslaved. In whispered tones, her name passed from one mouth to another, crossing cabins, fields, and plantations. Celia, they said, not in fear but in reverence, a name that carried the weight of courage, of resistance, of the refusal to remain passive in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Her strike against Robert Newsom resonated far beyond the physical act. It was a defiance aimed at the entire system that sought to control her, a refusal to let oppression define her existence. Though the gallows awaited, her spirit had already transcended them. She became legend in that liminal space between life and death, her courage etched into the memory of those who witnessed or later heard her story. The state could take her life, but it could not erase the power of her act, nor the message it carried. Even the oppressed could resist. Even the powerless could assert dignity. At just 19, Celia's life bore the weight of centuries of slavery, yet her name carried the weight of generations of resistance. In the stillness of that cell, facing the noose, she demonstrated that human will cannot be constrained, that courage can transform a moment of despair into an eternal legacy. December 21st, 1855. The winter air cut sharp against the small Missouri town of Fulton, each breath crystallizing into clouds as people gathered in grim anticipation. The gallows loomed against the pale sky, wooden and stark, a monument not of justice, but of control. Crowds pressed closer, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and something darker, complicity in the ritual of state violence. Into this cold stage stepped Celia, shackled, her steps slow but unwavering. She was only 19, but she moved with a composure that defied the spectacle meant to degrade her. What more could truly be taken from her? Her dignity had been denied, her voice silenced in court, her plea for humanity rejected. Her body had been reduced to property, a vessel for another's power, and yet, in those final moments, she rose beyond the role they had forced upon her. The rope was placed around her neck, rough fibers pressing into the soft skin of youth. The noose was meant to erase her, to render her life nothing more than a cautionary tale to others who might dare resist. Silence spread through the crowd as the executioner prepared, a stillness heavy enough to feel like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then the lever fell. In an instant, her life ended, but something far greater was set into motion. A girl perished, but a myth began. Missouri buried her as a criminal, branding her act as rebellion against order. But history, relentless and unsatisfied with silence, unearthed her again as a symbol of defiance, a figure whose courage could not be contained by the grave. The gallows that were meant to erase her instead immortalized her, transforming her from an enslaved girl into a lasting emblem of resistance. The crowd eventually dispersed, boots crunching against the frozen ground, returning to their lives as though the execution was just another winter's event. Yet whispers like injured, carried on the cold wind, whispers of the girl who dared to say no, who struck back when the law refused her humanity. Those whispers did not die. They traveled beyond Fulton, beyond Missouri, into the years and generations ahead, ensuring that Celia's name would not vanish with the smoke of that bitter December morning. Celia's trial and execution revealed far more than a single young woman's personal tragedy. They unveiled the grotesque reality of America's legal system under slavery. Her death was not a punishment for murder as the court claimed. It was a punishment for defiance, for daring to step beyond the role that the law demanded she inhabit. In refusing her master, she committed what that world saw as the ultimate rebellion. She declared herself human in a system built upon denying that very truth. The court's verdict, cloaked in the language of legality, stripped away any pretense of justice and revealed the law for what it was, a guardian of property, not of people, an enforcer of ownership rather than a defender of dignity. Enslaved women who heard the outcome understood its meaning too well. The verdict carried an unspoken message that echoed bitterly through their lives. Your body is not yours. Your voice is not yours. Your resistance will cost you everything. The courtroom became an extension of the plantation, a place where violence was dressed in legal robes, where the very institutions that claimed to protect order instead sanctioned cruelty. Celia's case was not an exception. It was a mirror held up to a society that measured worth by property and power, not by humanity. And yet, beneath the terror lived inspiration. For every lash endured, for every violation suffered in silence, Celia's memory whispered that resistance was still possible. She had stood against the unthinkable, and though she paid with her life, her refusal to submit cracked the silence that slavery demanded. Her gallows were meant to silence her forever, to make her an example of fear. But instead, they ignited something mythic, something that could not be chained or buried. Her execution transformed her from a solitary defendant into a lasting symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest condition, as the human spirit refuses annihilation. Celia's act stands as proof that resistance is not erased by punishment. It is carried forward, multiplied in memory, and woven into the fabric of defiance. The flames of her spirit burn still, not in destruction, but in remembrance, reminding us that the will to resist can never be fully extinguished. The story of Celia was buried for decades, hidden beneath the indifference of courts and the selective memory of historians who chose to dismiss her as a mere footnote in the larger narrative of slavery. Yet the soil of Missouri remembers, holding within it the echoes of her struggle, the quiet testimony of blood and ash. Her trial endures as one of the most chilling illustrations of slavery's cruelty, not simply because of its verdict, but because of what it revealed, a nation unwilling, or perhaps unable, to confront the full humanity of the enslaved. Celia was not seen as a young woman defending herself, but as property violating property, an object breaking the rules of ownership. In that grotesque distortion of justice, the mask of slavery slipped, revealing its true face. She was only 19, a girl by years, yet she bore on her shoulders the weight of centuries of oppression. Her strike against Robert Newsom was not an act of calculated murder. It was a desperate cry for freedom, for dignity, for the right to exist as more than a possession to be used and discarded. Her defiance did not spring from malice, but from the unbearable accumulation of violation, from the refusal to let her body remain the site of endless domination. In that single act of resistance, she made visible the humanity that slavery sought to erase. And though the rope tightened around her neck and the state proclaimed its judgment, her execution could not erase her defiance. The gallows silenced her voice, but not her meaning. In her act, Celia was transformed, from victim into symbol, from enslaved girl into martyr whose name would outlast those who condemned her. Missouri attempted to bury her story beneath the weight of law and silence, but history refuses such erasure. For in remembering Celia, we confront not only her tragedy, but also her triumph. She reminds us that oppression cannot fully extinguish the will to resist, that even those with no armies or weapons can strike a blow against tyranny. Missouri condemned her, but history cannot. Her defiance remains carved into memory, demanding acknowledgement, demanding reckoning, demanding justice even now. Celia's story is not just history. It is a mirror, reflecting injustice that still lingers in shadows. A 19-year-old girl, denied humanity, dared to resist and was silenced by the rope. Yet her act lives on, whispering that truth cannot be buried. If her defiance strikes you, if her courage unsettles your heart, let her name be carried further. Share her story, not for spectacle, but for remembrance. Subscribe, speak, comment, not for numbers, but to ensure that voices like hers do not fade into dust. Every echo matters. In telling her story, we grant her the dignity the court denied. Celia's act did not destroy slavery in a single stroke, but it cracked its carefully maintained facade, exposing the fragility beneath the claims of absolute dominance. Slavery depended not only on chains and whips, but on the illusion of control, an illusion that required silence, submission, and the erasure of individuality. Her defiance was a tear in that illusion, a fracture through which light entered. Her story became one of countless threads weaving the vast tapestry of resistance that spanned plantations, towns, and generations. Every strike against an overseer, every whispered plan of escape, every stolen moment of rest, every hymn sung in secret, all of these were rebellions, small and large, that weakened the edifice of bondage. Celia's voice, though muted by the gallows, joined this chorus and continues to echo through time. The memory of her defiance traveled, quiet yet persistent, carried in songs sung by women laboring in the fields, in stories whispered by elders around fires, in the silent gazes exchanged between those who recognized her pain as their own. Her story did not vanish with her body. It multiplied, resurfacing whenever courage was needed to remind the oppressed that resistance was possible. Newsome's name, tied only to cruelty and domination, fades into obscurity, little more than a footnote in dusty records. But Celia's name endures, not because she killed, but because she dared to fight for herself when the world denied her even the most basic right of self-defense. History often glorifies the grand battles and the names of generals, erecting monuments to men who fought with armies and banners. Yet the truer, deeper war was waged in cabins, in fields, in kitchens, and in the hidden chambers of enslaved hearts. These were the battlefields of survival, where endurance and defiance intertwined. Celia's cabin was her battlefield. It was there, Ethan walls meant to contain her subjugation, that she turned the space of her oppression into a stage of rebellion. Though the state condemned her to hang, she stood victorious in spirit, defying the silence demanded of her. In her resistance, she revealed a truth that no rope could strangle. The human will cannot be owned. The fire that consumed Newsome's body was more than an act of destruction. It was an act of purification, an unspoken declaration that no human being could ever truly be owned. Each crackle of flame was a rejection of ownership, each ember a burning away of domination and fear. That fire was not only the end of one man's tyranny, but also a symbolic cleansing, a moment when the imposed order of slavery was ruptured by the will of a young woman who refused to remain silent. Though the court sought to extinguish that fire, to reduce it to nothing but evidence in a trial and smoke in the wind, it spread quietly, invisibly, into the minds and memories of others. Fire cannot be contained when it is born of desperation and courage. It smolders in whispers, in songs, in the hidden defiance of those who carried on. Resistance took many forms: escape across perilous rivers and forests, sabotage of tools and crops, refusals to submit, uprisings both small and large. Each act was a thread in a vast, unseen tapestry of rebellion woven beneath the gaze of overseers and masters. Celia's act joined this chorus of resistance, her defiance blending with the struggles of countless others who dared, in ways visible and invisible, to assert their humanity. Her life, though brief, was not defined solely by tragedy, but by testimony, a testament to the unyielding spirit of the enslaved, the insistence that even in chains, dignity could not be annihilated. She did not write books to explain her philosophy. She did not lead armies across battlefields. Yet her single strike carried the weight of centuries, hitting harder than the swords of men twice her age, sharper than proclamations or speeches. She proved in that instant that dignity cannot be erased. It can only be delayed, suppressed for a moment, but never destroyed. And in the dark soil of Missouri, where blood and ash mingled, her legend took root. That soil, once intended to bury her, instead became fertile ground for memory. From it grew a story larger than her short life, a fire that still burns, reminding us that resistance, once sparked, cannot be fully extinguished. Generations later, her name resurfaces, not in the way her executioners intended, not as a closed case in dusty archives, but as a presence that demands recognition. She rises again in classrooms where her story unsettles young minds, in historical texts where scholars refuse to let her be forgotten, and in the whispers of descendants and activists who know that remembrance is itself an act of justice. Celia is no longer merely a defendant in brittle court transcripts. She is no longer reduced to legal jargon or the cold language of trial records. She has become a symbol of survival, of resistance that outlasts the very structures that sought to erase her. Her defiance does not stand in isolation. It echoes alongside Harriet Tubman's daring flights to freedom, alongside Nat Turner's fiery rebellion, alongside the countless unnamed women and men who fought, resisted, or simply refused to surrender their humanity in the face of enslavement. Together, these stories form a chorus of defiance, each voice different, but united in their refusal to accept bondage as destiny. Celia's act was not one of grand strategy or planned insurrection, but of personal defense. Yet it belongs to the same lineage of resistance that shaped the struggle for freedom in America. She stands as a stark reminder that history is not only written by victors or preserved in monuments of power. It is also shaped by those who, though crushed by systems of violence, left behind sparks that continue to burn. Celia, the enslaved girl of 19, did not live to see freedom's dawn, yet her act of resistance became freedom's shadow, the proof that even under the cruelest system, the human will resists annihilation. Every retelling of her story is itself an act of restoration, a refusal to let her be silenced. Her story belongs not just to Missouri, not just to the United States, but to humanity itself. She is part of the universal narrative of oppressed people everywhere who dared to say no, even when the cost was everything. To remember Celia is to remember that the struggle for dignity is timeless, that the fight for freedom does not always end in liberation, but in defiance that continues to live, teaching us, warning us, urging us never to forget. Her execution was intended as closure, a final silencing, the state's attempt to erase the threat that her act of resistance represented. The noose was supposed to end not only her life, but also the memory of her defiance, to fold her back into the shadows of forgotten names. Yet time betrays such intentions. What is buried does not always stay buried, and what was meant to be forgotten resurfaces stronger, sharper, and more enduring. Celia emerges not as a vanquished figure, but as a presence that haunts the conscience of history. She is invoked not in celebration, but in solemn reckoning, for her story forces us to confront the brutal realities that shaped her world. Her rope, meant as a tool of finality, instead became a monument of injustice, a reminder of the cruel paradox in which she lived, condemned not for violence, but for the audacity of defending her own body. Her strike, an act born not of malice but of desperation, became a symbol of courage that cannot be erased by courts or gallows. To speak her name is not to glorify violence, but to recognize the unbearable weight of the choices she was forced to make. Her life compels us to understand that what the world calls crime may sometimes be nothing more than the defense of dignity in the face of relentless cruelty. Celia's story cuts to the marrow of slavery's horror. She was forced into a choice no human being, much less a girl of 19, should ever have to face: endure endless violation and erasure, or resist and face the certainty of death. That impossible choice exposes the true nature of enslavement, stripping away every illusion of benevolence or civility, leaving only the raw, inescapable truth of domination and terror. In that truth lies her immortality. She is not a footnote in the sprawling history of slavery. She is the question history cannot erase. Every generation that encounters her name, and reckon with her, must ask what it means that such a choice was placed before her, and must acknowledge that resistance, however tragic, was inevitable. Celia remains, demanding remembrance, demanding reckoning, her defiance echoing louder than her execution ever could. So the story ends not in triumph, but in echo, in the reverberation of a single act that could not be silenced by rope or grave. Celia, the 19-year-old enslaved girl of Missouri, struck her master dead, and in doing so, she struck at the very heart of a system built upon violence and domination. For that act of resistance, she faced the noose with the weight of centuries pressing upon her young shoulders. Yet her name does not vanish with the tightening of the rope. Instead, it lingers, mythic and defiant, carried across time through the whispers of the oppressed and the writings of those who refuse to allow her story to be erased. The fields of Missouri may no longer echo with her footsteps, but her presence lingers there still, as if every stalk of corn and every stone of earth remembers her defiance. Celia's story is not one of victory in the traditional sense, but it is not a defeat either. She has become the embodiment of resistance, carved into history's stone by her own courage and by the refusal of memory to let her vanish. Her act is a reminder that silence, even when imposed by fear and chains, can be shattered, and that dignity has the power to rise even from the most brutal conditions of bondage. She did not accept the inevitability of her master's control. Instead, she drew a line and declared her own humanity in the most dangerous, unyielding way possible. She is martyr, she is myth, she is the girl who said no when saying no meant death. The gallows may have claimed her body, but time itself has transformed her into legend. Missouri buried her beneath the soil, hoping to cover her voice. But memory has resurrected her again and again in every retelling and every acknowledgement of her courage. Celia remains, not as property, not as a silenced victim, but as eternal defiance, an unquenchable spark that reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are those who refuse to bow. Her story endures because defiance endures, and because she stood where silence was demanded and chose to resist.